Richard and Pete set up their small tent, then tackled up with 10-foot bamboo rods, known as the Mark IV carp rod, Mitchell 300 reels, 12-pound breaker-strain line, and size 2 hook, which was baited with ballast paste. I was very fortunate to know the great man, and many years ago we sat in Richard's study, where he told me about the capture of his record carp, other thoughts on angling and other subjects. Sit back and really enjoy the most famous person in angling and a voice from the past.
It was an adventure in itself getting there, because I went with my old friend Pete Thomas, whom I'd known since he was 4 or 5 years old, in a rickety old pre-war Ford Anglia, and before we got halfway the body came off the chassis. We were driving through the night. We knocked up a garage proprietor who went round the village of Northleach, roused 2 of his mechanics. They got the car back in working order, and I shall never forget it. When Pete said, "Well, how much do I owe you for this?" the chap said, "Would 10 bob be all right?" Anyway, we steamed on and eventually got to Redmire Pool, fixed up our little tent where we kept our food and so forth. It wasn't so much to sleep in, but to keep things dry. And we sat fishing from about midnight or thereabouts on until just before 6 in the morning. And this was September, you remember, so it was still dark. In fact, it was about the darkest night I've ever been out on. You literally couldn't see your hand in front of your face. And Pete, having done all the driving, was a bit tired, and he said, "I think I'll get my head down for an hour or so." And he crawled into the tent, and not long after that my electric bite alarm buzzed, and I picked up the rod, felt the line, felt it was slithering slowly out through the rings, dropped the pickup of the reel in and struck at this fish, and it felt like hitting a sandbag. And I can't say that it was a very dramatic fight, because the fish promptly shot off to my right, way beyond a great dense thicket of weeds, and then at the end of the lake, towards which it was heading, there were some alder trees that had been cut down, but the roots were in the water. It was if you looked down in daylight, it looked like a mass of eels having a fight, all these curled roots all around one another. And I knew they were there, and I thought, if you get into that, whatever you are at the end of my line, that's my lot. So I really bent into the fish. I put on all the strain that the tackle could stand, and I can remember hearing the line making a noise like wind in the telegraph wires. But it did just stop the fish in time, and it turned into this weed bed, at which time Pete was up and out of the tent. And he said, "Now take it easy." I remember him saying this. "Take it easy, that's a big fish you got there. Take your time." So I waited a bit to see what would happen with the line still taut. Then I pointed the rod straight down the line and gave a few tugs on the line between the butt ring and the reel to see if that would move it. And it did, and it came out of the weeds, went back the way it had come until it was directly opposite me, and from then on it was really a question of pull devil, pull baker. The fish would gain 10 yards of line off me, and then it would slacken off, and I'd get the 10 yards and perhaps a few yards more back, until eventually it was practically under the rod point. And I said, "Pete, switch the light on to see what we got here." And Pete switched the light on, and I think that scared the fish, and it dived diagonally to my right under, I suppose, 100 years accumulation of dead brambles that had fallen down into the water and really burrowed its way in. And Pete, without a moment's hesitation, flung himself face downwards, and all he was wearing at that time was a shirt, just the shirt, face downwards onto this heap of brambles, and clapped our big landing net over the hole that the fish had crashed its way through to get in. And then he inched himself forward, and I tell you, his chest was a mass of scratches the next morning. He worked his hand in until he could get it onto the fish's nose and turn it round. And then the fish made a bolt to get back into the open water, but the landing net was in the way, and it bolted straight into the landing net. By that time, I'd put the rod down, and I was able to help Pete drag the thing on the bank. And, well, there we were. We got a rough weight because we hadn't got a spring balance that read high enough. The highest reading one we got was up to 32 pounds. So we tied 2 spring balances together side by side and hung the carp in a wet sack on that. Added the 2 readings together and got a figure of 41.5 pounds, which was obviously not very accurate, but accurate enough to let us know that it had beaten the former record, which was 31.25, by a fairly comfortable margin. So we then put the fish in the sack, the wet sack, tied up the mouth, put it back in the water so that it wouldn't take any harm. And fairly early the next morning I got to a phone and rang the zoo, the London Zoo, and said, do you want a 40-pound carp? And they said, we've got a 14-pound carp. And I said, no, 14, not 14. It was very accurately weighed the next morning with an inspector of weights and measures and 1 or 2 witnesses present, found to weigh 44 pounds. And it resided in the zoo for many, many years after that. But I think the most important thing to say about this carp, well, there are 2 things I want to say about it. One is that Pete Thomas and I were fishing with identical tackle and identical baits no more than 4 feet apart. And it was purely a matter of luck that it took my bait and not Pete's. And the other thing is that this fish has since been beaten, in my opinion, by a 51-pound 6-ounce carp caught from the same pool by Chris Yates, which has been turned down by the official Record Fish Committee, and in my opinion quite wrongly, because there can be no possible doubt that Chris Yates's 51-pound 6-ounce carp was fairly caught in season. It was a carp, it did weigh what it was said to have weighed, and why the Record Fish Committee turned it down is beyond my comprehension.
That just shows what a true gentleman he was.